Okay, let's get started, guys. Bit of a smaller group today, but that might be good to aid some discussion. Um, as always, the Linux Foundation meetings always start with the antitrust policy, and the antitrust policy can be found on the website highlighted here. And if you are a member of a Linux Foundation company, you can also contact Andy Updegrove for any concerns over antitrust. And on that note, we can get straight into the topic for discussion today, which is the Scratchpad sort of AI form sort of guidelines. If you recall, last time we again went through these guidelines, and we had a few questions and comments to be made. I've worked on them over the last month, or some of them, but there's some that I kind of wanted to bring again up for discussion. This was brought up at the OpenChain board meeting recently, and that there was sort of a desire for this to progress into something that we could start sharing around to get further input from the community later this year. So we're probably closer to it than we were over the last few months. But as I said, there's certainly a few additional comments that I wanted to just clarify. And good to see Nick on the line, because the first one was kind of a comment that Nick had brought up last time. So we talked about the license obligations for model data sets, and the proposed wording that we had was, as you can see on the screen, a process shall exist for reviewing the identified licenses of model data sets, including all the different types of data sets, as well as the model system itself, to determine obligations, restrictions, and rights granted by each license. But I recall there was kind of a discussion, Nick, around one small caveat is that obligations of a license of an upstream model or data set may or may not apply to the downstream AI model. And I just wanted to expand on your thoughts there and how we can sort of change the appropriate wording here, because you are right. It may not be appropriate, and I don't know, just like a small change, like relevant identified licenses, or whether there's something else you were thinking about.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to clarify. I would welcome also inputs by the group on that. I think what I was after is it may not be relevant in every single case to do this full determination. And it's not necessarily, necessary or good thing to review all these things every single time. They may be depending on the use, or depending on the circumstances. I think what I was after was, this particular step may not be necessary. And so perhaps we should be either more lightweight or more specific when we think that particular step is helpful. And one of the reasons why I was saying, hey, it may not be necessary in every single step is because, in some cases, like you may decide, or an entity may decide that they don't have to do the full analysis that happens sometimes when people want to test things, or when they want to do something for internal use. So they may decide that they won't go after, they won't perform the full analysis. So that's kind of the rationale for my comment. So I'm happy to kind of wordsmith that particular language a little bit. I think others are welcome to contribute as well. I may need a minute to make sure I capture the spirit of that. What we're trying to accomplish here, and still not create traps for ourselves.
That's great. I've just put the link to the document in the chat. It's open to everyone to go in, have a look, edit, modify. I assume edit and modify. Let me know if you can't edit or modify. I definitely think you can add a comment. So feel free, Nick and others, to go in and with the whole point of this meeting now is for us to update these words so we can maybe work on that wordsmithing.
I like the suggestion about relevant or maybe potentially relevant. I think a question is, are the obligations or the licenses the potentially relevant one? Because a license may be valid, like I think according to what Nick was saying, but maybe the resultant obligations or restrictions because of the use case are not. Something like that.
Okay. I mean, maybe because I've read this too many times, does this actually state, though, we are required to meet those obligations? It just says a process shall exist for reviewing the now relevant identified licenses for the model, as well as the model system itself, to determine the obligations. We don't have to do anything with those obligations. To your point that if it's an internal one, I think Nick said, you may not have any obligations, but somebody's obviously in this area. Feel free to start typing things out if we think it's appropriate. Here we go.
Yeah, I'm typing something, and so I'm adding. I don't know if you can see it in the taking into account the intended use of the model. And the reason why I'm saying that is because, depending on the intended use, you may not need to do all that analysis. You may not need to review all these things at all. You just, you just bypass the entire exercise entirely, depending on the circumstances. And so I think at this stage of the exercise, what I'm suggesting is let's make sure we don't create too many steps that, oh, I have to do all these things, but they are only relevant in some cases. So unless the group disagrees, but that's kind of the thinking here is that we think about these things as not absolute, oh, thou shall do these 5 things, no matter what. But perhaps we think about these things as, happening in a broader context, and one aspect is what is the intended use of the model. If it's going to be distributed widely, that's perhaps something slightly different from something that is going to be used only internally, perhaps for testing purposes. If I'm making any sense.
Anyone else got comments here? Okay. Well, I do like the genericizing. That's the wrong word.
Yeah.
I think the point you're trying to get to here, I think, is spot on. If it's not appropriate, we shouldn't mandate it. Okay, so then moving on there, a documented procedure to review the document, the obligations, restrictions, and grants and rights granted by each identified license as appropriate or as intent. Yeah, as appropriate. Someone just looking down at the comments here, should we describe variations in obligations based on how the model is used without modification and how private models is derived from an open source model? Do we think this wording here that was proposed by, I think it was Nick, I think meets that?
I feel like from a very high level, which maybe is what we want here, it seems like it does account for that. That comment is valuable in a very specific use case, but it seems like that was broad enough to cover that.
I think we can resolve those 2 points then. Yeah. And then Jimmy says, okay, that some data sets may have unclear licenses or unknowns, such that thus it should be documented in the procedures how to work with those. I don't think we've got Jimmy on the line here, but wondering. I mean, do people agree with this? I mean, we could add, part of the process could include how we handle unclear or unknown licenses. We're not stating how one deals with those, but we should have a process that deals with them. Do we think that is that sort of within scope? Is this what we wanted to try and grasp? I'd like people's thoughts on that.
Was there any language in the open source parallel to this about unknowns? The open source document that we kind of started with.
Well, this was the document. I can't remember. Oh, I deleted the bottom bit, which I think was the wording. Let's open it up again. If I don't have access to it. So here it is. What should I do? Search for unknown. I don't think so. It's my gut feeling, but I may be wrong.
Hi Matthew, this is Jan. I just joined
Hey, Jan.
to get a glimpse of what you are about to do here, and maybe I may help you with the question. What are you searching for? I've been through the
Someone
52.
proposed, and I hope I still have it open here. Oops. So Jimmy stated in the text here, how do we handle unclear licenses or unknown licenses? And someone then just proposed, what was it like in 5230?
Okay. It's if there is no license associated with things, then in general you don't have the rights, and this would mean that you cannot modify, use, or whatever, take it. This is what you have to more or less understand or accept. Yeah. If you find the author, you can try to ask him to get to clarify or identify a license or declare a license. But it's
and I don't think we should be capturing that sort of information. That's never really been in the remit of OpenChain and would be company specific, but having a process to identify or having contacts within a company to, understand what to do with an unclear license, that is probably within scope. What a company does with that information is up to them. Is that okay? Does that make sense?
absolutely fine for me.
So
that's how I'm understanding Jimmy's comment there.
does that seem reasonable?
Hey, so I don't want to split hair, but I think that's the I don't know if it's a separate process from the one we just mentioned, but you know, in all fairness, I think this is covered. Like, if you have a process to review the relevant and identify, I would imagine, the relevant licenses, then you kind of have to deal with like unclear situations. I think that, you know, it comes along with it in some way. And like, I'm not sure about adding unknown here, because if you don't know about them, like, what are you supposed to do? You know? So what I'm suggesting is, so let's not create a second process. I'm not sure it does that, but you know, a process shall exist on how to handle this. I don't know if we need a second process, because I think it's kind of a byproduct of the first exercise.
Do others agree with that point? I tend to agree with that point. I think if you're reviewing licenses,
I would agree as well. I think it's inherent in this having a process for reviewing the identified licenses already. I mean, you're going to assess them,
excellent.
and if someone doesn't understand, then they would have a, you know, that would be implied that you'd have a process, whether you go to legal or.
Yeah.
But this requires that you definitely, for every piece that you are taking in, you definitely have a declared license. And there might be pieces of software or models or whatever that do not have anything declared. It's something that can happen, yeah. So it's published and nobody declared a license, or you cannot be sure whether this is the correct one that is declared, and then because it appeared already somewhere else, then you are in doubt, and so therefore maybe kind of a resolution would make sense.
Sure. I think third-party licenses, you know, proprietary or, you know, would be beyond the scope of the open source review. Open source, like for OpenChain. I think that's a separate issue, right? I mean, it's part of the due diligence, but not necessarily. I mean, I don't know. Is that? I don't know that that's typically, you know, something in the OpenChain policies for reviewing third-party proprietary licenses as well. Is that something that should be in there as a separate step? I mean, it should be done.
Yeah, I agree with that. We've always been sort of license agnostic, whether it's an open source or a proprietary license. So I infer this is both. But we can.
So perhaps it's inherent in just reviewing the document for the, you know, it's inherent in the initial license obligations section. So whether it's open source or whether it's proprietary, you need to review the relevant identified licenses, obligations, restrictions, and rights.
Great.
So
Therefore, I think we're all in agreement that it is inferred in that wording that people are reviewing licenses, whatever they are, unknown, unclear, open source, proprietary, as required. Good. Okay. Moving on then, Nick, another comment talking about transparency. Further discussion on transparency, we will expand this at the next meeting. Nick, do you have any further comments? You're on mute if you're talking, Nick.
Yeah, sorry, I had difficulty finding the unmute button. I think the general comment I was making, I just double checked the document and we don't mention transparency once. Maybe I missed it. But I guess my point is, like, I think the group should consider the extent to which we want to have a section addressing transparency in some way, shape, or form, because I think that's going to be a recurrent requirement from jurisdictions around the world, and I think it would be helpful for members or whoever is trying to use that document to kind of get in front of these upcoming regulations to have like something addressing the transparency or disclosure obligations that are going to come down the pipe. So that was and I was just giving one example of such obligation. I don't know how hard they're going to come after it, but like from the state of California. And so yeah, so my suggestions was, hey, do we want to add a section on transparency? Maybe it can be super lightweight. It could be a placeholder for like more stuff down the road, but at least we are not blindsided.
So, I mean, the history of transparency in this has been fraught, and when it was first proposed, it caused a lot of disagreement. That was probably 12 months ago now. Clearly, the legislation has moved on a bit. People are understanding transparency a bit more. I'm happy to propose some wording, and then I guess it's down to the OpenChain board to see if they are comfortable with that wording. But I'm wondering whether, again, we do that light touch approach of you meet transparency requirements for regulations for intended purpose of the model or something along those lines.
Or I'm wondering if this is just a broader kind of requirement that a company is considering, because transparency is going to be one of many hot topics.
Yeah.
I don't know if we generally make a reference as a requirement that there's somebody reviewing regulations or requirements from that touches the entity, and that would include something like transparency. Because it does seem to me, outside of our previous conversations on transparency, it would kind of just be sticking out in this document because it's very specific. So I don't know if we did take that approach of referencing just the need to stay abreast of requirements. I don't know if that's a competence. I don't.
Oh, so I like that idea then. So it's slightly more hidden in, well, competence was more around people are competent, but in terms, yeah, could we put it in somewhere else under another obligation?
I mean, so I was not aware of that history in the group, and so if
Mhm.
that's if that's an issue, we can address it later or address it differently.
But that was always the point. We'd address it
Yeah.
later, and we're here 12 months later, and I don't know how others feel, but I think we're getting more used to what transparency means. It's not full necessary disclosure of everything. It's relevant depending on the risk. And I reference the EU AI Act, where if it's sort of a chatbot, the only level of transparency you need to say is, well, it's a chatbot. You don't need to disclose the model behind it because the intended purpose is not high risk enough to do that. And I'm wondering whether this time last year the knowledge in the group was not sufficient enough, and they thought in every use case we're going to have to disclose every bit of information, and that's clearly not the case now.
But I think there was a good suggestion to have, sometimes you have that in this type of documents to actually have a function where you stay abreast of, regulatory developments and whatnot. And so that could be the placeholder for, these type of things. I don't know if we have that right now in the document,
No,
but
you don't.
something of a more like a monitoring function.
Whoa. So, well, let's just put it at the bottom and see where we end up with. Governance, would you say it's that?
Something like that.
So just a comment here. I think this whole document needs to be read and interpreted in the context of the regulatory environment. So I think we need to be careful not to try to replicate what's covered in the regulations into this document. I think this
No, I
document is
agree with that.
of a supply chain, B2B, and I think it's important that we have as many of the details as suggested or optional, so that companies can work well together. I think to the extent we put too many things that are mandatory, it might scare folks away from signing up.
I agree with you there. And again, I wasn't going to say, in my example of the chatbot and that transparency, but being aware of the legislation or regulations that are coming out in a certain jurisdiction. I don't know. I'd like to think that that's what good business is, but then I can imagine sort of small companies, they may struggle to sign up to something like that because they don't have the resource to be aware of every legislation coming out. If it's not relevant to their company and their models.
Hey, Matthew, this is Prasad. I have a question. I was just going over the document as you were speaking. Is there a terminology or clause where we are covering, when you mentioned about the process to document, kind of curious, do we also talk about like a potential process that an organization can support to regularly not just intake newer models, but also at some point, as models mature, as organizations mature, a procedure to sort of decommission models as well, or for whatever reason, block usage of models, depending on, let's say, their supplier has some, fictitious or, some litigious terms and contract, or, there could be a reason why the organization believes that the model might get into a potential problem with regards to compliance, things like that. I'm just kind of curious.
No,
Do we want to cover that aspect?
I mean, it's not for me to say. I think something like that is within the remit of this working group. It should be proposed and discussed and debated. So if you think, Prasad, it is worthwhile, let's capture it and see what the community say.
Yeah. I would like to at least kind of make the proposal. This is kind of in terms of similar to how we handle in the past open source components. When it comes to open source components, we do have appropriate processes to bring in those components, validate them, and add them to the set of standard green database of components to be used. Likewise, we also have a procedure or some process governing how these components will get at some point in their life cycle, or some sort of a life cycle management process is what I'm looking for, to regularly decommission or potentially block the usage. Having that provision doesn't mean that having the process will require the sorry. That's just my thought, that trying to see if we can draw some anomaly similar to open source components and then have that applied to the models as well.
What do others think to that?
Sorry, I didn't hear you. Can you please repeat?
I said, what do other people think of that?
I'm kind of processing it right now myself. It feels like it fits into this governance bucket we're kind of brainstorming on right now. I'm referencing 5230 as we speak, just to see what that says about it, how that deals with kind of internal governance programs.
Yeah, I mean, we can just add, or at least my proposal is to not necessarily dictate or whatever the terms of the process as such, but just having, like, making a note that it would, if we can have a process to, just like we have a responsible AI process that will do the necessary impact analysis and intake the usage of these AI models, um, having a provision to regularly review and having that those models at some point in their life cycle, having a life cycle management policy in place to handle the uh, potential decommissioning or handling the life cycle of those components, those models.
I wonder if that's almost too specific. Like how can we high level that in terms of just stating it almost as a program exists to somehow review or take account of or something the use of models and data sets internally. If we start enumerate, although that's high level as it is, that you just said, kind of what's the kind of plan?
Life cycle management. Yeah, life cycle management. Right.
That's, even though that's high level in itself, it's a specific requirement kind of deriving from some of these regs. So I don't know if there's a way to high level that a little bit more.
Mm. I'm thinking perhaps instead of having maybe life cycle management, can we maybe up level that to just say, like, part of the responsible AI governing model should also include provision, or like for supporting.
Sorry, start again, Prasad.
So what I meant to say is like the responsible AI model, like so there, organizations that adapt will require to have a responsible AI model that will support a provision to manage not just the initial intake, right, or not just the initial impact analysis, but also to manage the overall life cycle of the AI models and the data sets across the organization, right? I think that's what we are trying to imply.
Yeah, I now get, so it's not just we've done it once, it's, I wonder if, could we put this under that license bit that we were doing before, and a process shall exist for continually reviewing relevant licenses? I mean, this goes beyond licenses, doesn't it?
Yeah, this one, I mean, we are not primarily looking for license perspective, but in general, like, this could be again triggered potentially because of a license, but also other factors such as supplier, for example, right? that there are other aspects that could potentially trigger that review process that will eventually lead to the progress in the life cycle of that AI model usage across the organization. Because if you only talk about the process to handle like the initial intake and like a simple keeping it at that level, I don't know, again, like when you think about a year or 2 years from now, models are always going to keep coming, and there could be older models that might enter into other potential state of decommissioning, or at some point organizations will need that ability to clearly point out that, hey, these are all the models that we can use, these are something that has been used in the past but no longer allowed, that sort of thing. Again, it's up to the individual organizations to implement those policies and processes, right? We're not going to get into that, but just saying at a higher level that organization potentially having a provision to have that RAI model supporting an ongoing review and life cycle process, or ongoing review process to manage life cycle of the adopted AI models and training data sets.
Prasad, do you want to go into the document here, and let's see if we can wordsmith some your thoughts here?
I'm wondering, so how do we think about this in terms of what we're doing here in terms of kind of a delivery, an A-bomb, almost kind of, it seems like a broad requirement, once again, kind of deriving from regulations that I don't know if we need to itemize here. Maybe we break it out as an example. We started this government section. There's a framework to review this. This could include the need to have a process to consider life cycle of AI models and data sets used. I'm just wary of it kind of being placed here, and once again, kind of adding requirements to this document that could scare people away. Conversely, if as a group we see that this kind of compliance internal program to continually review is something that's so important that we need to enumerate in this document, I'm not sure it is among all the kind of requirements we're seeing stemming out of regulations. Is there value in someone downstream knowing this specific?
Yeah, I think one aspect that we can think of is like with the new EU CRA Act, right? At least on again, I can't speak for all the AI models, but on the FOSS components aspect, there has been an increased need to essentially having policies and processes in place to do lifecycle management for all FOSS at least, and that is not just from the process need perspective, but also from the EU CRA Act, we need to retain record retention has become one of the mandates. So we've seen that because of that record retention, the necessary to have the need for having this lifecycle management is much more, and obviously having a lifecycle management and process and the corresponding records will serve artifacts when it comes to handling those for the FOSS components. So I'm kind of coming from that perspective that in future, if there is a need for organizations to track and monitor and potentially archive records of their model usage or how the model usage has evolved on their products and solutions, this could be a useful factor, right? I mean, having a governing process to manage life cycle of AI models could be quite helpful. But I see your point. I think we the intention is clearly not to pile up additional requirement. I mean, that could, I mean, especially if you are organization wise, like adopters are relatively small or medium sized, that might not be required. So maybe having this provision, if we mandate this, then that could probably scare people away. So I see your point, but it's just that for organizations which have products, let's say, spanning across several years, and there could be AI model evolution that potentially can, needs to be tracked on that particular AI model usage for a given product or a service that is shipped from an organization. I think this could be worthwhile in that
Are you
effect.
suggesting that there's an expectation that someone upstream has an ongoing obligation to inform downstream folks of what they're finding in their governance and management? Because I think if you look at this document and this process and the artifacts will come up with from the perspective of the downstream recipient, they're getting a snapshot in time of what is known, and then they're going to move on and do what they want to do. The folks upstream may continue to do monitoring and management, but I don't think we want to suggest that there's an ongoing expectation to the downstream recipient to inform them from every little update that they find.
Oh, okay. So you're targeting primarily the downstream folks here. So not necessarily the upstream participants, like who may be like running certainly, for example, like DevSecOps or some product operations per se, right? I mean, those are the folks, like if you look at like primarily the product governance teams or the product operations governance, those are the folks that I was targeting, because those are the folks that they become ultimately responsible for supporting or providing artifacts or evidence, or potentially retain artifacts for longer periods of time pertaining to products and services. But if you are targeting primarily the tail end or potentially the downstream users, that this may not be applicable to them. I agree there.
Yeah, I think for an internal document, these statements make absolute sense. I'd love to hear other folks' opinion, but the way I see OpenChain is more of supply chain, and for whatever reason, I tend to sit in the eyes of the downstream recipient. What are they going to get? What do they need?
Okay, what I can do, I mean, again, Matthew, maybe what I'll do is I'll probably think through further, and maybe potentially maybe I'll look into the document and perhaps add a little bit of language. But let me know if that is something that is acceptable, obviously, by everyone in the community to take in. I see that the downstream participants potentially may not be of much, this may not be of much use, but let's say that if there are organizations that are required to abide by primarily on like product operations governance records or product operations governance standards, I think this potentially could be useful. But I'm not saying that this needs to be put in one of those mandatory terms, but rather something that we may want to recommend um, for organizations to think about, of having, right? If there is a provision that they can have, I think more of a recommendation than a mandate.
I think, Prasad, you certainly have the permission to go and propose wording. Please go ahead and do that either now or between now and the next meeting, and then we'll just have another discussion. And if we need to seek guidance from the board, then we can do so. Or we may have got feedback initially from the community. But I would strongly recommend propose words that if you think are going to be beneficial to the overall sort of goal of this, it seems within its, the right ethos. It's just whether this working group as a whole and OpenChain do want to accept words with, that you have proposed. And that's not specific to you, it's to everything that we propose here.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay.
So I will put a comment in here that sad to review. So we touched on the transparency, but we kind of got off the topic, didn't we, Nick? We kind of just left it at governance. Do you want more than that? Or were you just suggesting that we stay up to date with legislation rather than?
I don't know that we need the governance. I thought that was kind of a neat way to address the transparency comment. I'm not, we can park it and see how it goes. I think we'll all understand that this is kind of lurking, so it can be addressed later on, I think.
Rowan, should this section require any known transparency statements made about the model should be recorded and communicated? Is this from the same area here? So if there are obligations for transparency, a documented procedure to review, document the obligations, restrictions, rights of each license as appropriate. So in the spirit of kind of not adding a new section on transparency, do we want to, for example, if legislation requires aspects of transparency, that this is captured here? So this is just an opportunity to provide clarity on what we mean here.
So this is not about disclosure, though. It sounds like Rohan's comment is going after disclosure of identified licenses. I don't think we talked about that in the license section. You know what I mean?
Should this section require that any known transparency statements made about the model should be recorded and communicated alongside the identified licenses? So we say a process shall exist for reviewing relevant identified licenses, and then we say and transparency statements or transparency statements.
Is this going to kind of the bomb element? It's almost like a transfer of things that were disclosed and models ingestion as part of the AI bomb. Is that what's being stated?
Fortunately, Rowan's not here.
If I understand, if I understand this correct, I think we are talking about the identified license associated with these models and the corresponding legal constraints that one needs to abide by. Is that what we are talking about here? When you say obligations, those are the license specific legal obligations, right?
Yeah, but I'm wondering whether Rowan is referring to any transparency statements as an obligation. So if either a license requires it or regulation requires us to be transparent in whatever form that we are doing so. Making sense?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the type of the license, at least, right? I mean, certain licenses will come with that obligation, like, so yeah, I mean, those licenses with does come with that publication obligation, um, will have to abide by, and those specific models will potentially will need to be transparent and essentially published.
Is it more than the license obligation, though? Is it also regulatory obligation? Because something could be under an open source license, but if the regulators say that you have to say it's a chatbot, then you have to say it's a chatbot. The license doesn't necessarily capture that.
Right.
I mean, do we have something called transparency obligations here? But then that creates a whole section on transparency.
Yeah, I think beyond the license obligation, I think that's probably uh, the primary one. But again, it really depends on specific organization. At least from my experience working with our legal partners, it essentially boils down to the specific legal the legal entities of that given organization, right? So sometimes they do make a change to have those obligations limit to just the license level, but in some cases the legal might choose for whatever reason to go beyond that and add additional obligations, which, due to some specific reasons that is specific to the organization. So that again, it's dictated and um, governed by the legal entity for the given organization. So we may not be in the right position to um, add any additional transparency obligation beyond what is the bare minimal required or mandated by the license itself. I think those additional obligations that can apply, but again, it has to probably come from the legal for the respective organization.
Anyone any comments on that? Prasad, I think you've got more homework to do.
Yeah, well, yeah.
And more text in here as relevant.
I mean, in theory, whatever template they choose, SPDX, whatever, is accounting for this too, I think. Maybe transparency is beyond the scope of the BOM, but ideally, fields that have been deemed to be required versus optional in a certain BOM template is addressing these transparency needs in like a business to business, upstream to downstream kind of solution we're looking for. So I think we can talk about it in the same conversation. I don't know if I like how broad this is generally when we're talking about transparency. I don't know if this adds any sort of barriers to adoption, if a company would see this and they would get nervous about it.
Okay.
Let's test it out. Let's test it out and see what others think. I will highlight to Shane that kind of transparency has come up a lot today. And as I said, the board, when we were sort of originally given the steer, was, you know, maybe transparency isn't something we want to deal with right now, deal with it later. But as I said, we are later now. So are there things that we want to try and capture now that we're much more advanced in our understanding of what transparency actually means? So let's say we've addressed that one. Add a line around transparency, and if needed, you capture what is required. I think we've done that with the license obligation, the one below. Obligations need to be identified at the upstream location so it can be passed down to the downstream location. I think that's what we were talking about earlier on, Prasad. Dave's not on the line. How do we encode acceptable uses according to the license into the BOM? More and more Rail family licenses are popping up. We will eventually have to use taxonomy, class of accepted uses, something as similar to these licenses. It's not on the call, isn't it? No. Let's put a pin in that one. Look for an overlap. What's this? Access 4201. Anyone here have knowledge of ISO 42001? Maybe this is homework for me. Your process should be within scope of the jurisdiction you are working in. I think we'd try to capture that further down tonight, or certainly with the transparency. Laurie, you're online, are you? Yeah, I saw you before. Laurie. Last time we discussed having your process should be within the scope of the legislation within the jurisdiction you're working on. I think we'd try to capture that here with the transparency, but also this governance bit down at the bottom. Does that kind of meet your points, Laurie? You're on mute if you're talking. No. Can people hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. So we discussed last time we were going to completely remove the concept of AI bill of material fields. Speak now or forever hold your peace.
So are we deleting this whole section? We're keeping the reference to the possible BOM providers at the top,
Yeah.
or have we decided to kind of?
Apologies. That was my intended things to remove.
people agree with this sentiment that we don't want to itemize potential. Did we have that conversation last week? Can't recall.
That
It
I
was
think was
better
what
not to
generally.
itemize.
Yeah. That removed quite a few, which I like. Maybe should see. Testing results. A process exists to examine the testing results and determine whether it's suitable for the organization. I think this is way out of context now. So I guess originally when we started this, we didn't know whether we were just going to focus on an AI bomb or more related topics around AI. And this really is digging, well, maybe it's gone off topic here, but these are the testing results of the AI model that we should ensure that we have a process in place to examine the results. I do feel as though this has gone out of context of the of compliance. I'm going to remove that. Consider exploring this more. While AI technologies offer unprecedented efficiencies and capability, the complexity and potential risks associated with their autonomous operations necessitate a framework where human judgment can intervene. There should be an oversight process designed to monitor, evaluate, and if necessary, correct AI outputs to mitigate errors of unintended consequences. Now, this might simply be in an AI policy, you need a human to review the output. But again, with human oversight and transparency, these were topics to let's deal with those later kind of category. But we are now later, so any further comments on human oversight? And then I'm just wondering whether this again talks to the testing results that we had earlier, maybe slightly out of scope here, but if we want to refocus the scope on AI bomb compliance management, that we say that if a AI bill of materials is produced by AI, then there's human oversight, which is completely different, I think, to this here. We're saying there should always be human oversight with any AI outputs, and that nothing to do with the AI bill of materials. So do we think we've gone out of the scope of the intended nature of the document by starting to talk about human oversight?
It does seem to belong in this kind of amorphous section we're building with regulations and transparencies and now oversight. I don't know if we do proceed, maybe we combine all of those into a similar section.
Right then, so we've gone through, which was kind of the purpose of the call. We've cleared quite a few different sections. Prasad, you've got some homework to do around maybe just have a think about that governance piece down at the bottom here. But I think we've probably all got some homework to do, and maybe just see if you can find some time over the next month to just read this 4-page document, 3-page document. No, it's a few more pages. 6 or 7-page document, but I think we're getting to a stage where we probably want to share this around more widely, and hence having a sort of detailed review and of it in an overall manner would be beneficial. So what do we think of that? So maybe we can all take some action to review this between now and the first week in March, and we can come back and maybe propose a final session next time to go through this, with the idea that the next board meeting is it's not until mid-June, I think. So maybe we aim to present at that board meeting the outcomes of the working group.
That sounds good.
Sounds like a plan. Yep.
I like the idea of a plan. So hopefully we can get some commitment from folks. Maybe I can give everyone an aid memoir in a couple of weeks' time just to review it. And then we can come back for the last couple of sessions before we go to the board.
Makes sense.
Yes.
Great. Well, if there's nothing else, I'm happy to close the meeting. Thank you for all your time today. Appreciate it. And we'll speak again soon.
Thanks for driving.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you,
Thanks,
Matthew,
Brian.
and everyone. Thank you.